The restaurant looked calm from the outside, but inside it carried a quiet pressure that everyone could feel. Soft lights reflected on polished tables, and the sound of cutlery mixed with low conversations. People came here to feel important. Expensive clothes, calm smiles, and slow movements filled the room. This place was not just about food. It was about status. In the middle of all this, a young black waitress moved carefully between tables. Her steps were light, and her face showed focus more than emotion. She had learned that in places like this, it was better to stay quiet and invisible. She wore a simple uniform, neatly pressed, and carried herself with respect. Every table received the same care from her, no matter who was sitting there. Her day had started early, like most days. She had taken a long bus ride, stood in the kitchen helping before opening time, and now she was several hours into her shift. Her feet hurt, but she never slowed down. Bills waited at home, and missing a day of work was not an option. She worked here because it paid better than most places, even if it meant dealing with people who looked down on her. At one of the best tables sat a wealthy man. He came often and liked being noticed. His clothes were expensive, his watch shiny, and his voice louder than necessary. The staff knew him well. He tipped well sometimes, but he also liked to remind everyone that he had money and power. People around him laughed at his jokes, even when they were not funny. That evening, he was in a playful mood, talking proudly about his success. He spoke about business deals, travel, and how hard work made him who he was. Others at the table listened, nodding and smiling. To him, the restaurant felt like his stage. In the corner of the room stood a grand piano. It was there mostly for decoration, but sometimes a hired player would perform on special nights. Tonight, it was silent. Still, it gave the room a sense of class. Many guests barely noticed it anymore. As the waitress passed near the piano while carrying plates, she quietly hummed a tune under her breath. It was something she had done without thinking. Music had always been a small comfort for her during long shifts. The sound was soft, almost lost in the noise of the room. The wealthy man noticed. He stopped talking mid-sentence and looked in her direction. At first, he smiled as if amused. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary. When she returned to his table to take an order, he leaned back in his chair and raised his voice. "Are you singing?" he asked, loud enough for others nearby to hear. She froze for a second, then gave a polite smile. She apologized softly and said she did not mean to disturb anyone. Her voice was calm, respectful. She hoped that would be the end of it. But it was not. The man chuckled and exchanged looks with the people around him. "I didn't know they hired entertainers too," he said. A few people laughed, unsure if they should. She kept her eyes down and wrote the order carefully. She had learned not to react too much. Reacting only made things worse. "What was that tune?" he continued. "Sounded like You Think You Know Music." She hesitated, then answered honestly. She said she just liked melodies and sometimes hummed without realizing it. She said it politely without any pride. The man smiled wider, clearly enjoying the moment. He glanced toward the piano. "You like music? That thing over there costs more than most people's houses," he said. Some guests nearby started paying attention. The room slowly grew quieter. The waitress felt the air change. She felt exposed. She tried to move on, asking if there was anything else he needed. But he waved his hand. "Wait," he said. "Since you like music so much, why don't you show us something?" Her heart started beating faster. She did not fully understand what he meant, but she could feel it was not going to be kind. "Sir, I'm working," she replied gently. "I'm not allowed to." He interrupted her with a laugh. "Relax. I'm just joking," he said, though his tone did not sound friendly. "Or are you scared you can't actually play?" The people around him looked uncomfortable. Some avoided eye contact. Others leaned in, curious. She swallowed. She felt her face grow warm. She knew moments like this could go wrong very quickly. She also knew that refusing a powerful customer could cost her job. Her manager was watching from a distance, uncertain but silent. The man leaned forward. "Come on," he said. "It'll be fun. Give us a little performance." His words sounded light, but the pressure behind them was heavy. It was clear he was not asking. She stood still, caught between fear and dignity. Part of her wanted to walk away. Another part remembered how many times life had forced her to stay quiet just to survive. She glanced again at the piano. It brought back memories she rarely allowed herself to think about. Long nights, cheap keyboards, learning by ear, practicing when no one was watching. Music had been her escape, but it had never paid the bills. She looked back at the man and nodded slowly. "If you want," she said softly. A smile crossed his face, one filled with expectation and amusement. He leaned back, crossing his arms, ready to be entertained. The waitress took a deep breath and walked toward the piano, not knowing that this moment was about to change everything. The waitress walked slowly toward the piano, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. The wealthy man leaned back in his chair, smirking, as though he expected some kind of joke to begin. Guests around the room began to quiet down. Some shifted in their seats, curious about what would happen next. Others glanced nervously, unsure whether they should be watching or pretending nothing was happening. She reached the piano and paused, placing her hands on the keys. They felt cool under her fingers. For a moment, she just looked at them, trying to gather herself. The noise of the restaurant faded. It was like time slowed down for a heartbeat. The man at the table looked directly at her, waiting for a performance, expecting something embarrassing. She swallowed and took a deep breath. She remembered her lessons from years ago, the long nights spent practicing quietly when no one was around. The small keyboard she had at home was old and worn, but it had been her friend. Music was where she felt safe, where she could express herself without fear. Tonight, that feeling came rushing back. She knew she could play. She just needed to trust herself. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Come on, let's see what you've got," he said, his voice teasing, meant to provoke laughter. He had no idea what he was about to hear. She pressed a key softly, a single note, then another, and slowly, a melody began to emerge. At first, it was simple, quiet, almost timid. The room remained silent, unsure of what was happening. Then, the music started to grow. She played with feeling, letting the melody take over. Her hands moved naturally, almost like they had a mind of their own. It was beautiful, soft, and emotional. The rhythm pulled at the hearts of everyone in the room. Conversations died down completely. The only sound was the piano and the music that seemed to wrap around every person present. Guests were stunned. Some leaned forward in their chairs, eyes wide, not believing what they were hearing. Others exchanged glances, whispering to each other without interrupting the music. Even the staff, who had seen many things in the restaurant, stopped and watched quietly. The wealthy man's face changed slowly. His smirk disappeared. Confusion and surprise replaced it. He had expected something shallow or silly, but the music was deep and touching. The waitress closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the melody fully. Each note carried her emotions, her struggles, and her hidden dreams. She had never played for anyone who expected nothing but mockery. It was a strange mix of fear and liberation. Her body relaxed as the music flowed through her. She forgot about the wealthy man, the audience, and the judgment in the room. There was only her and the piano. The wealthy man tried to hide his reaction, but it was impossible. His eyes widened slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. He looked around at the other guests, some of whom were wiping away tears silently. He realized he had misjudged the young woman. He had assumed she would be embarrassed, maybe make a mistake, and amuse everyone. Instead, she held the room in her hands. People who had been skeptical or bored were now completely captivated. Some could not believe that someone who worked as a waitress could play with such skill and emotion. The music was not just a display of talent. It was a story, a feeling, a truth that only she could share. Each note seemed to tell of her perseverance, her quiet life, and the strength she carried every day. The wealthy man felt an unexpected shift in the atmosphere. He had thought of himself as in control, but now he felt small, unsure. He watched her play, feeling something he had not anticipated: respect. He did not speak, not wanting to break the spell. The music held him captive just like everyone else. The waitress continued, her fingers moving swiftly yet delicately. She added emotion to every chord, letting it swell and fall naturally. The melody grew, filling the restaurant with warmth and intensity. The guests, once tense or nervous, were now absorbed in the sound. Some were leaning on tables, resting their heads lightly on their hands. Others sat completely still, afraid to interrupt the moment. The quiet of the room made her music even more powerful. She was no longer performing for approval or validation. She was performing because it was who she was. Every hardship, every early morning, every unspoken word came through her playing. The piano became a bridge between her private world and the crowded restaurant. She played with honesty, showing everyone a side of herself that few had ever seen. When the melody softened toward the end, there was a gentle pause. The wealthy man realized he had not just been watching a performance. He had been confronted with the truth of her talent and her spirit. The laughter he had expected was nowhere to be found. Instead, he felt something unfamiliar: admiration, tinged with guilt. He had underestimated her, like so many others, and now he knew he had been wrong. The final note lingered in the air, and the room remained quiet for a moment longer than expected. People looked at her, some with disbelief, some with awe. Her chest rose and fell as she sat still, letting the silence honor the music. The performance had ended, but its effect had just begun. The wealthy man opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He looked down at his hands, then at the piano, realizing he could not find a joke or sarcastic comment. Everything he had planned in his mind had disappeared. She had turned a moment meant for ridicule into one of beauty and truth. The power he thought he had in the room had shifted, subtly but completely. Some guests clapped softly, then louder, until applause filled the room. People smiled, some wiping their eyes, some leaning back in their chairs in astonishment. The waitress slowly rose from the piano, her hands still trembling slightly from the intensity of the moment. She had shown herself fully, and the room had accepted it. The wealthy man finally spoke, his voice quiet and unsure. I didn't expect that," he admitted, glancing around. There was no laughter, no mockery, just truth. He realized he had underestimated her, and for the first time he felt a little embarrassed. The room was no longer about status or appearances. It was about talent, courage, and the quiet strength that had always been there but rarely seen. The waitress returned to her station, carrying herself with calm dignity. She smiled slightly, not proud but satisfied. She had faced an impossible situation and emerged intact, showing a part of herself that could not be ignored. Her day continued, but the moment at the piano would stay with her, and with everyone who had witnessed it. The wealthy man watched her move away, feeling something shift inside him. He had learned a lesson without being told, a lesson about respect, humility, and the hidden depth in people we often overlook. That night, the restaurant had been transformed. What had begun as a challenge, a moment meant to embarrass, had become a story of courage, beauty, and undeniable talent. And in that change, everyone present had become part of something bigger than a simple night out. They had seen the power of truth and the strength of a quiet life revealed in music. The moment after the music ended, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The guests were still, eyes wide, as if no one wanted to break the spell that had settled over the room. The waitress returned to her station, her hands slightly shaking but her posture steady. She tried to act calm, but inside, her heart was racing. She had played without expectation, without fear, and for a few minutes, she had shown the world who she really was. The wealthy man sat at his table, staring at her as she moved about the room. For a few moments he could not speak. His mind tried to find a way to regain control of the situation, to return it to the light mockery he had planned. But nothing came. He had underestimated her, and now he had no script to follow. He had expected embarrassment or a mistake, but instead, he had seen skill, courage, and grace. Guests who had initially whispered to one another now looked at him, waiting for his reaction. Some had smiles of wonder, some had expressions of disbelief. The power in the room had shifted subtly but clearly. It was no longer about money, status, or appearances. It was about honesty and talent, about someone revealing themselves without fear. The waitress continued her duties quietly, taking orders and serving food. Her hands were steady, her steps measured, but there was a new energy in her movements. Something had changed. She had always carried herself with quiet dignity, but now there was a visible confidence. She had faced a challenge and emerged with integrity and skill, and everyone could see it. The wealthy man finally spoke, his voice low and uncertain. "That was impressive," he admitted. His words lacked the usual sarcasm or jest. There was no mockery, only a grudging acknowledgement. He had seen something he could not ignore. The sound of the piano, the depth of her playing, and the emotions she conveyed were undeniable. It was more than music. It was a story, a feeling, and a truth that could not be erased. Some guests began to clap softly at first, then more loudly as they realized the performance had ended. The applause grew, filling the room with sound. It was not just appreciation for skill. It was recognition of courage, of a person stepping into a space where she had not been expected to shine. The room that had once felt tense now felt alive with admiration. The waitress allowed herself a small smile. She had not expected recognition, nor had she sought it. Music had been her private world, a place to express herself when life demanded silence in other areas. But now, for the first time, that private world had been shared with strangers, and it had touched them. It was a moment she would never forget. The wealthy man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of his companions. Some avoided his gaze, uncertain how to respond. Others smiled at the realization that the woman he had tried to belittle had revealed a side of herself that they all admired. He felt a mix of embarrassment and respect. The joke he had intended to make had backfired, and the truth of her talent had left him unsure of his place in the room. He tried to regain some composure, but the effect of her performance lingered. The sound of the piano, the grace with which she had played, and the emotion behind each note had shifted the atmosphere. The guests now saw her not just as a waitress, but as someone with depth, skill, and resilience. The power dynamic had changed, subtly yet unmistakably. The waitress returned to a table to take an order. She moved with the same care and professionalism as before, but now her movements carried a quiet strength. Her eyes met those of the customers she served, and they smiled at her with a new recognition. They saw someone who had faced challenge with courage, someone who had transformed an uncomfortable situation into a moment of beauty. The wealthy man watched, feeling a shift within himself. He had assumed that money and status could control the situation, that he could entertain himself at someone else's expense. Instead, he had been confronted with something he could not manipulate: talent, courage, and authenticity. It was a lesson he had not expected to learn that night. The restaurant seemed to hum with energy. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter, more thoughtful. Guests spoke with a newfound respect for the waitress, for the woman who had turned an awkward challenge into a moment of inspiration. Staff members exchanged glances, silently acknowledging what had happened. It was a shared understanding, a recognition of a rare and powerful moment. As the evening continued, the waitress moved through her tasks with care and precision. She took orders, served plates, and handled requests with her usual professionalism. But now there was a subtle difference in the way she carried herself. She had faced a test, and she had passed with grace. The piano had become more than an instrument. It had become a stage for her courage, a way to express her inner strength. The wealthy man finally rose from his seat, approaching the waitress hesitantly. He cleared his throat, unsure of how to address the situation. I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice sincere but awkward. "I didn't expect what you just did. It was remarkable." The waitress paused, listening. She had learned not to expect apologies or acknowledgement, but she nodded politely. "Thank you," she said simply, her tone calm and respectful. She did not need to overstate her response. The music had spoken for her, and it had been heard. The wealthy man returned to his table, visibly affected by the experience. He had been confronted with humility, with the realization that talent and courage could not be purchased or controlled. The lesson lingered, quiet but profound. He had come to the restaurant expecting amusement, but he left with a sense of respect and reflection. The guests who had witnessed the performance spoke quietly among themselves. Some commented on the skill and emotion of her playing. Others spoke of the courage it took to face a challenging and potentially humiliating situation with grace. The atmosphere of the restaurant had shifted, from one of quiet tension to one of shared appreciation and admiration. The waitress continued her work, handling the rest of the evening with care. She had shown herself fully, revealing a part of her life that few had ever seen. Music had always been her refuge, her way of expressing emotions that words could not capture. That night, it had become a bridge between her world and the world of the restaurant, connecting her to people who had never expected to see her in this light. As the evening came to a close, the guests departed with smiles and nods of appreciation. The staff tidied the tables and prepared for closing. The wealthy man lingered for a moment, reflecting on what had happened. He had intended to entertain himself, to assert control, but instead, he had learned a valuable lesson. The young woman had demonstrated talent, courage, and authenticity that could not be ignored. The waitress cleaned her station, her hands steady and her mind calm. She had faced a difficult moment and emerged with dignity. The piano, silent once again, seemed to echo the power of what had just occurred. It had been more than music. It had been a declaration of strength, a moment of truth that had left a lasting impression on everyone present. That night, the restaurant was not just a place for dining. It had become a place of revelation, where a young woman's hidden talent and courage had transformed the atmosphere and challenged assumptions. The wealthy man had learned humility, the guests had learned to recognize talent in unexpected places, and the waitress had learned that even in moments of fear, she could rise and show the world who she truly was. After the last note had faded, a strange calm settled over the restaurant. The chatter of patrons had ceased, replaced by a quiet awe. The waitress returned to her station, carrying herself with quiet dignity, though her hands still trembled slightly from the intensity of the moment. She tried to resume her work as if nothing had happened, but she knew that everything had changed. Tonight, she had shown a side of herself that had always been hidden. The wealthy man remained seated, staring at the piano and then at the waitress. His face was a mix of shock, respect, and a touch of embarrassment. He had walked into the restaurant expecting amusement, a moment to assert his power, but instead, he had witnessed something entirely unexpected. The confidence he had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a quiet recognition that he had misjudged someone he thought was beneath him. Guests around the room whispered quietly to one another. Some had tears in their eyes, moved by the unexpected performance. Others nodded in understanding, recognizing the courage it had taken to play in front of people who might ridicule her. The room felt different now, transformed by the honesty and talent of one individual. It was as if the music had lifted a veil, revealing a deeper truth that everyone sensed but had not seen before. The waitress continued her duties, taking orders and serving food with the same professionalism she always had. Yet there was a subtle change in her demeanor. She had faced a moment of potential humiliation and had turned it into an opportunity to express herself fully. The confidence she carried now was not loud or boastful. It was quiet, steady, and undeniable. Guests who had watched her closely could see it in the way she moved, the way she held her head, and the calmness in her eyes. The wealthy man finally cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had settled over his table. "I have to admit," he said, his voice low and a little unsteady, "I did not expect that. You were incredible." His words were sincere, lacking the usual sarcasm or mockery he often used. He looked at her, searching for a reaction, unsure how to express the mix of respect and embarrassment he felt. The waitress nodded politely. She accepted the acknowledgement with grace, not seeking praise but simply recognizing the truth of his words. She had never played for validation, only for herself, and tonight had reminded her of the power of that choice. Her music had spoken where words could not, conveying the depth of her experiences, her perseverance, and her hidden dreams. The guests began to clap softly at first, then more enthusiastically as they realized what they had just witnessed. The applause was genuine, filled with admiration and appreciation. It was not just for the skill she had displayed, but for the courage it had taken to step into a situation where she could have been humiliated. The room seemed to hum with energy, a shared recognition of something rare and beautiful. Some staff members exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the significance of the moment. They had seen many things in the restaurant, but rarely had they witnessed such an unguarded display of talent and courage. It was a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary moments could occur when someone dared to be themselves. The wealthy man, feeling the shift in the atmosphere, remained quiet. He had expected to control the situation, to entertain himself at the expense of someone else. Instead, he had been humbled. He realized that his assumptions had been wrong, that he had underestimated the young woman who had dared to share her talent. It was a lesson he would not forget, a reminder that respect and humility could not be purchased or demanded. They had to be earned. The waitress continued her work, serving tables with careful attention. She moved gracefully, her presence commanding quiet respect without needing to say a word. Patrons watched her, some in awe, some in silent admiration. She had turned a potentially uncomfortable moment into a defining experience, demonstrating the strength of her character and the depth of her talent. The wealthy man finally rose from his seat, approaching the waitress with hesitation. His usual confidence was replaced by a tentative sincerity. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice quiet but earnest. "I did not mean to put you in an uncomfortable position. What you did was remarkable, and I misjudged you." The waitress listened calmly, her expression neutral but open. She had learned that not all apologies needed immediate acceptance or response. She simply nodded, acknowledging his words without letting them define her. The music had already spoken for her, and it had been heard. Other guests observed the exchange, noting the change in the dynamic. The wealthy man, who had once seemed untouchable, had been humbled by an unexpected display of talent and courage. The waitress, who had been in a vulnerable position, had emerged with dignity and strength. It was a powerful lesson in humility, respect, and the importance of recognizing talent wherever it exists. The evening continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations were quieter, more thoughtful, as guests reflected on what they had witnessed. The room seemed to carry a sense of shared understanding, a collective acknowledgement of the power of courage and authenticity. The waitress moved through the space with ease, her confidence quietly radiating to those around her. As the night progressed, the wealthy man returned to his table, still thoughtful. He had come expecting entertainment and control, but he had left with a new perspective. He realized that true respect could not be commanded. It had to be earned through honesty, talent, and the courage to be oneself. The lesson was clear, and it was one he would carry with him beyond the walls of the restaurant. The guests gradually began to leave, many offering words of praise and appreciation to the staff. The waitress continued her work, her focus unwavering. She had faced a challenge that night and had emerged with her dignity intact. The piano, now silent, seemed to hold the echoes of her performance, a reminder of the power of music and the strength it could convey. In the quiet moments after the last guests had departed, the staff gathered briefly, sharing smiles and quiet comments about what had happened. The evening had been ordinary in some ways, but extraordinary in others. They had witnessed a moment of truth, a display of courage and talent that had transformed the atmosphere and left a lasting impression on everyone present. The waitress finally took a moment to breathe, leaning slightly against a counter. She reflected on the experience, realizing that she had not only shared her talent, but had also claimed a small victory over the fear and uncertainty that often accompanied her work. Music had given her a voice, and that voice had been heard and respected. The wealthy man, meanwhile, left the restaurant in silence, still processing the events of the evening. He had been confronted with a truth he could not ignore. Talent, courage, and integrity could not be mocked or dismissed. They commanded attention and respect, regardless of status or wealth. It was a lesson he had learned in a single, unexpected moment. The night ended with a sense of closure, but also with a lingering awareness of the power of authenticity. The waitress had faced a potentially humiliating situation and transformed it into a moment of beauty and strength. The wealthy man had been humbled and reminded of the importance of respect. The guests had witnessed a rare and powerful event, one that would stay with them long after they left. In the quiet aftermath, the restaurant seemed to settle into a calm reflection. The piano remained in the corner, silent but not forgotten. It had been the medium through which courage and talent had spoken, creating a moment that transcended the ordinary. And in that moment, everyone present had been changed, even if only slightly, by the truth that had been revealed. The next day, the restaurant buzzed with stories about what had happened the night before. Staff members talked quietly among themselves, still amazed at the talent and courage they had witnessed. Guests who returned mentioned the performance, asking questions about the young waitress who had left such a strong impression. It seemed that one moment had transformed the ordinary into something memorable. The waitress arrived early for her shift, as usual, her steps light but her mind still filled with the events of the previous evening. She felt a quiet pride, a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with recognition or applause. She had faced a situation that could have embarrassed her and had instead shown herself fully. That feeling of strength stayed with her as she prepared for another busy day. Even as she moved through her duties, carrying plates and taking orders, she noticed the subtle changes around her. Patrons greeted her with warmer smiles, and some spoke to her with a sense of familiarity they had never shown before. The staff treated her with a new level of respect, silently acknowledging her bravery and skill. It was a small but meaningful shift in her world. The wealthy man returned to the restaurant later in the week. This time, he was quiet and composed, carrying an air of humility that had not been present before. When he approached the waitress, he offered a sincere smile. "I wanted to thank you again for that performance," he said. "I didn't realize what I had underestimated. It was a lesson for me." She nodded politely, accepting his words without judgment. She had learned that not everyone would understand or respect her abilities immediately, but that did not matter. The music had spoken for her, and that had been enough. She continued her work with calm efficiency, aware of the attention but not dependent on it. The restaurant itself seemed to carry a lighter, more positive energy. The staff worked together with a renewed sense of teamwork and appreciation. Guests lingered longer, some asking about the piano and the woman who had played it so beautifully. It was clear that her performance had become a topic of conversation, a story that others wanted to share. But for the waitress, it was not about fame. It was about having a moment where her skill and courage could exist without apology. Over time, the wealthy man began to frequent the restaurant less for social posturing and more with a genuine interest in observing and appreciating talent. He no longer approached the waitress with the intent to mock or test her. Instead, he acknowledged her presence and the quiet confidence she carried. The dynamic between them had shifted entirely, marked now by mutual recognition rather than tension or power struggle. The waitress, too, felt a change in herself. She had always known her talent, but she had rarely had the opportunity to share it in a way that mattered. The piano had become more than an instrument. It had become a symbol of her strength and her ability to claim space without apology. Each time she walked past it or thought about the night, she felt a renewed sense of empowerment. Her colleagues noticed the change as well. Some approached her, asking for advice or sharing their own experiences of fear and courage. She listened quietly, offering gentle encouragement. She had discovered that her actions had inspired others, not through words or ego, but through the simple act of being true to herself. The impact of her performance extended beyond the restaurant walls, touching lives in ways she had not anticipated. Even patrons who had witnessed the performance continued to talk about it, remembering the emotion and skill she had displayed. Some returned to the restaurant specifically to see her, to experience the calm and beauty she brought to her work. The piano, once a silent decoration, now carried a presence that was impossible to ignore. It had been a stage for a moment of truth, one that had transformed perceptions and revealed a hidden depth. The wealthy man occasionally reflected on his behavior and the lesson he had learned. He realized that status and money could only influence so much, and that true respect and admiration came from recognizing the qualities in others that could not be bought or demanded. The young waitress had shown him this through her actions, leaving an impression that would stay with him far longer than any material possession or social performance. As weeks passed, the story of the performance became part of the restaurant's quiet legend. New staff members learned of it, and regular guests mentioned it when speaking about their experiences. It had become more than a single event. It was a reminder that courage, skill, and authenticity could transform even the most ordinary moments into something extraordinary. The waitress remained at the center of this story, not seeking attention but quietly living her truth. She found herself more confident in everyday interactions, not just at the piano but in all aspects of her life. She spoke with more clarity, held her head higher, and moved with a sense of purpose that had not been present before. The night she played in front of the wealthy man had reminded her that she had value, skill, and strength that could stand on their own, independent of anyone's judgment. The piano continued to sit in the corner of the restaurant, a silent witness to what had occurred. Sometimes, she would glance at it and feel a quiet connection, remembering the power of the music and the courage it had taken to play. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in moments of uncertainty or challenge, one could rise and reveal their true self. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, she stayed behind to practice. The room was empty, quiet except for the soft sounds of her playing. She allowed herself to feel the full emotion of the music, letting it flow freely. In those moments, she realized that the performance had been more than a lesson for others. It had been a turning point for herself. She had discovered the depth of her own courage and the strength of her voice. The wealthy man never mocked her again. Their interactions were civil, marked by respect rather than expectation. He had learned that some things could not be controlled or trivialized, and that true talent demanded acknowledgement. The shift in their relationship reflected a larger lesson, one about humility, respect, and the transformative power of honesty. The story of the performance became more than a single event. It became a symbol of what could happen when someone dared to be authentic in the face of challenge. Guests who heard the story were inspired, staff members who witnessed it were moved, and the waitress herself carried the memory as a reminder of her own strength. The restaurant, once a place of routine and quiet tension, had become a place where courage and talent could be recognized, celebrated, and remembered. Her life continued, with the same early mornings, long shifts, and quiet struggles. But now, she carried an inner knowledge that she had faced judgment, fear, and expectation, and had emerged stronger. Her music had spoken, her courage had been seen, and her dignity had remained intact. The night at the piano had been a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed it, reminding them of the hidden depths in people that often go unnoticed. As the days passed, the memory of that night remained vivid. She would occasionally hear a patron mention it, or notice a colleague glance at her with quiet admiration. The impact of her courage continued to ripple outward, touching lives in subtle but meaningful ways. The wealthy man, too, would recall the lesson often, reminded that true power comes not from wealth or status, but from respect, humility, and the ability to recognize the value in others. The waitress continued to play, not for recognition, but for herself. Each note carried the memory of that evening, the strength she had found, and the quiet affirmation of her own abilities. The piano remained a place of expression, reflection, and courage, and in that space, she found a sense of peace, knowing that she had faced a moment meant to undermine her, and had turned it into something lasting, powerful, and beautiful. In the end, the night at the piano became more than a story. It became a lesson, a memory, and a quiet inspiration for all who had witnessed it. The young woman had faced judgment with grace, shared her talent without apology, and left a lasting impression that would echo in the hearts of those present for a long time. She had shown that courage, honesty, and skill could transform even the most challenging situations into moments of beauty and truth, leaving the world a little brighter and more aware of the hidden strength in people around them.